Hi, I'm Charles Harrison from the University of Southampton. This podcast is a short presentation on the pros and cons of various kinds of statistics obtained from the track statistic function found on many pieces of software. Usage statistics aren't just the preserve of software giants like Google and Amazon. They can be very useful for the small-scale education user as well. The data used as an example for discussion here was obtained from a chemistry lecture course hosted on Blackboard. This included 9 full video lectures, which were chopped up into 54 smaller chunks, as well as 8 worked example videos. The track statistic function on Blackboard was used to generate this data. The results were then downloaded individually and put into a special piece of software, which is actually available at the link below, to amalgamate the data and make it a lot easier to analyse. So, onto the data itself. The easiest data to analyse is the day of the week and time of day data. Over such a broad length of time as a day, the data lacks any real significance. The reasons for a quiet day on the VLE could either be really obvious, such as a heavy day of lectures, meaning students just don't get the time to go online, or so subtle as you can't pin it down, such as the after effects of the pound a drink night the night before. Either way, there's something which is unlikely to be controllable for the person looking at the data, so we're going to move on from these. Now, I've got to admit, this is probably my favourite graph. The graph reflects student lifestyle wonderfully. I mean, let's face it, who's seen a student before 10 o'clock in the morning if they don't have lectures? But actually we know that they're often practically nocturnal, with the busiest time of day being the evening, and in halls of residence, work going on until the small hours, which is exactly what's reflected in the graph. However, educationally, it's not that useful. As someone who's looking at this kind of data, you probably realise that learning happens outside of the usual 9 to 5. So apart from using this to persuade academics of the value of online resources, it's not of that much use for actual direct educational interventions. The problem with both these statistics is just that. They lack opportunities for interventions. They are of great interest and are very useful for persuading reluctant academics, but beyond that, not so much use. So let's move on. So when we actually worked out how many of each user fall into each category, you've got a fairly even split here. Now, the numbers themselves may seem fairly arbitrary, but this represents fairly consistent groupings. You've got those who didn't watch very many, those who watched a significant number, and those who watched absolutely loads, and of course the ever-present group who didn't engage at all with the resource. This paints an interesting picture. And actually, the first thing many people do is attempt to correlate this to something like exam results. There are two major problems with this approach. The first one is that correlation does not imply causation. Okay, let's assume you got great results. Fantastic, but you cannot guarantee that those who watched a lot of videos did really well because of the videos. They may well be your conscientious students who would have worked hard, whatever. Or more likely, the students' grades were actually to do with factors way beyond your control. The second problem with this approach is I did actually go to the effort of correlating these results, and you get almost a perfect scattergun graph. Okay, there was no correlation, even if I fiddled with the data. So perhaps in this case, the lack of correlation does not imply the lack of causation would be more appropriate. Now, this graph represents the notorious hockey stick graph, often used to persuade people about the effects of man-made global warming. And just like that, it's just as controversial. Any attempt to implement an online resource in a university will meet the same response. Students will only use it at the last minute. And unfortunately, there's some truth to that. However, this should not be written off, because actually there was significant use before then, and I thought this was worth delving a bit deeper into. In an attempt to understand this data a bit better, I attempted to look at the data from a perspective of different kinds of use over time. So the students were split into 4 separate groups depending on when they started watching the videos. When you take these students and view their own personal graphs as line graphs laid over each other, you see certain factors. This graph actually shows the group of students who were earmarked as formative learners, who actually used the videos from very early on whilst the lecture series was still happening. And as you can see, they use the resource regularly and often. When plotted, you see a whole new group of students arise. You have those who used it from the very beginning, those who only used it just during the revision period towards the end of the taught course, those who used it immediately before the exam, and the ever-present group who used it the night before. So this is not to say that the ones who use it from the very beginning didn't use the resource from the night before, but then there's nothing wrong with that. Students use the textbooks the night before the exam, and we're not going to stop giving them that because of that. Now this is where things get interesting from an educational point. By dividing the students into groups by hypothetical usage types, we have the beginning of a targeted study starting from an informed position. If you were looking further into this data, first you would need to survey the attitudes of each group to discover if the usage was deliberate or accidental. Assuming it is, you can start to design interventions to try and move students from the poorer positions, such as the night before the exam, to the conscientious formative learners in the first category. Obviously the study would require suitable levels of ethical clearance, but it offers far more scope than using the data on its own or starting from an uninformed position. Usage statistics can be used for more than just justifying the existence of online resources. They can be the starting point for worthwhile educational research. Check out the links at the bottom of this video for the literature which I found whilst researching this, and for the free software which made using Blackboard statistics a lot more manageable.